Hi. Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Day of Action, Racial Justice, curated by the New Haven Pride Center in partnership with the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. My name is Elizabeth Nearing. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the curator of ideas programming at the International Festival of Arts and Ideas. And it is such a pleasure to get to be here to introduce you all to this panel. Before we begin today's program, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event. Both the New Haven Pride Center and the International Festival of Arts and Ideas were founded and operate on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Wappinger, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac peoples. We hope that wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the Native people whose lands you occupy and the history of the place you are in. You can find out more about Native lands at native-land.ca. And now I'm excited to welcome you to today's program. The Center's Day of Action programming was created in 2020 as many conferences aimed to challenge us as a community to combat issues that divide us and create injustice within our own community. Today, our Day of Action is focused on racial justice. Join us throughout the day as we confront some of the work needed to ensure that our community is a place free of racism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and anti-Asian sentiments. Finally, before we begin, we'd like to thank our sponsors who made today's program possible. Without the support of organizations like the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, Connecticut Humanities, and the City of New Haven Department of Arts, Culture, and Tourism, we would not be able to do these types of programming. Thank you all for all of your support and for all of you who are watching and participating in this event today. Now, let's begin our panel on combating anti-Asian sentiment in the queer community. I would be honored to now introduce you all to Minnie Chiu to begin this program. Off to you, Minnie.
Hello, everybody. I'm Minnie Chiu. I am an educator and activist. I have backgrounds in both. I am really excited here to introduce people who are doing incredible work in this community today. So I want to introduce our speakers who are going to talk about some of the work they're doing, including Caroline Tanby-Smith and Tran, who I'm really excited to be working with and hear from. Please introduce yourselves because I can't do justice to the work that you've been doing. Vu, would you like to start?
Oh, I would love to. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm so excited for this panel. Hi, everyone. My name is Vu Tran. I use he, him pronouns. And I am currently the reigning emperor of an amazing organization called the Imperial Sovereign Court of all Connecticut. And most of my activism work in my adult life has been in the LGBTQ plus community. And this year, we're raising money for the New Haven Pride Center as part of our beneficiaries. And we are so appreciative of the work that they are doing and the conversations that they are bringing up. And throughout my time as being an LGBTQ plus activist, I've kept my foot in the water on Asian American issues because I feel like a lot of times folks who do this work, we kind of have to split our time in many different places. So I've always tried to keep abreast of that part of my identity. But with things going on, especially during COVID and the recent shootings and the heighten of anti-Asian sentiments, I've found myself redirecting a little bit to invest more of my time and energy into Asian American issues. And so I'm super excited that they are being highlighted today and that I am on a panel with you two amazing folks.
Wonderful. So good to meet you, Vu, and so good to meet you, Minnie. My name is Caroline. I use she, her pronouns. I've been in New Haven for about 10 to 11 years now. A lot of my sort of the force behind my work is a love of this city and a love of this place and the people here and the people that are fighting hard every single day to make it a safer place for everybody. So that's a big part of my heartbeat of my work. Currently, right now, I run an organization, I co-run an organization called Collab, which is an organization that supports local entrepreneurs, specifically people of color and women entrepreneurs, to create businesses and use entrepreneurship as a pathway towards building good and sustainable businesses, but also building power and really being able to have that agency and ownership to shape their communities. I've also, outside of Collab, been a part of the sort of burgeoning AAPI New Haven group that was started a couple months ago in response to the Atlanta shootings and murders. And it's been really, really special to be a part of this group of individuals who are working really hard for the Asian community here in New Haven. And the last thing I'll say is this is only the second panel that I've been on where I've talked about queerness, which I just think is so special to me. And the first one I was on in the Pride Center was such a moment of reflection for myself, to think about my queerness, not just in a private setting, but in a public setting. And so I'm just so excited for this conversation. I'm so excited to meet both of you and excited to learn a lot today.
Thank you guys both. It's honestly, I echo the sentiment. I'm very excited to be working with both of you. It's not just amazing work that you're doing. It's creative. It's imaginative. It really opens up the doors for us to do so many things together. Just being an emperor allows us all to be, designated, subjects of a crown, and so that's where the queerness of our lives comes into play and can be fun and productive and thoughtful. And how do we use all of that amazing creative energy in the struggle against racism and the struggle against homophobia, the struggle against sexism and misogyny? How do we use that in ways that are productive for our social justice agenda, right?
Right.
And there's so much happening. As Carolyn, was mentioning, Atlanta was it was a wake-up call. What if we were not already awake and terrified? And I have to tell you, personally, it's had an effect on me living in New York. And also I have allergies. I'm sure many of us do, but I have really pretty bad allergies. I cough all year round. I'm allergic to everything. I should live in a bubble. But being that humans can't live in bubbles these days, at least not yet, I do worry that, that I could be a subject of violence. And so that's something that that has weighed on me. And working with students, I think a lot about racial justice, and it hasn't, passed me by the idea that that in many cases, violence against people of color sometimes is enacted by other people of color, or by women, or by gays even. And so these are things that I really want us to start thinking about and start working on. And we all know some of the work that's been going on that others of us won't know. So we could share some of that with one another. But in thinking about how we as Asian Americans and as queers can sort of combat violence, not just against Asian Americans, but against all other people of color. I was wondering if we can maybe explore the idea of the ways in which anti-Asian violence might be different from other forms of violence against groups of color and other groups, right? And think about whether or not these differences might even matter in how we think about our approach in combating these different kinds of violences.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting that on this panel alone, we seem to have three very different ways of combating violence out there. I am with the Imperial Sovereign Court of all Connecticut, and the crowns are wonderful and they're glorious and they're shiny. But the point of the crowns is not necessarily the affluence, but it's a tool and a resource to build a platform and to have that platform be used for something. So there's a bright, shiny object on your head, and now you see my face, and now you see who I am, and now I can use that to make you listen to me. And I think visibility is super important in our community, especially in the LGBTQ community, especially for Asian Americans. I can't tell you how many times I'm in a nonprofit room or a boardroom or some other room, even in the nonprofit world that's very liberal, and I'm the only Asian voice there. And then we have Caroline, and I love all you did talking about resources and agency and how crucial that is. And people don't realize that, like, that is the bottom layer of so many movements, is allowing people to have agency over their body and their economy and what they do. And Minnie, you in education and spreading that work out there. But on the point of kind of the intersectionality in between racial movements, I struggled with this a little bit because when a lot of things were happening with Black Lives Matter, I was trying to figure out what my role was in that conversation, because I feel like there's a lot about white privilege and white supremacy, and then there's Black lives and Black voices, and then we have this like kind of middle lane of being Asian American, where we do have some experiences of being minorities and people of color and being ostracized or oppressed in certain ways, but our experiences are very different than the experiences from the siblings of our Black and brown brothers and sisters and siblings. So figuring out how we can empathize with that and what we've experienced, but still give them their due space and their due ways to explain what's going on with them and letting them have their movement as well.
Thanks so much for that, Vu. I like you. We should hang out. I want to talk to you more, both of you all more. I really appreciated your point about visibility. It makes me think about me as a young queer in Lexington, Kentucky, seeing Margaret Cho for the first time on YouTube, and me and my sister just being the audacity of an Asian woman being funny on stage was just so invigorating, and I think that. I hunger for more of that. I think we're still sort of woefully in need of those kinds of stories and that kind of visibility. And thank you, Vu, for being so visible. Like, thank you for your audacity to be visible. I think that must be so powerful.
Quick bridge. I'm not sure if you're originally from Lexington, Kentucky, but I am literally sitting in Lexington, Kentucky right now because I am at their coronation.
Are you serious? Wow.
I've never come to Lexington, Kentucky before, so this entire panel experience was entirely meant to be.
That's amazing. Say hi to my mom. She'll love you. But yeah, I mean, answering your question, Minnie, I think it's also a fascinating question. I mean, I think what interestingly first comes to mind is that anti-Asian violence within Asian communities is really different. If you're brown, if you're a woman, if you're queer, if you're trans, it's really different in that, or income disparities among the Asian community are so vast and so wide. I think it's actually the group with the largest income disparity. And so that feels really important. I think that's something I've been thinking a lot about after the Atlanta shootings, just sexual violence among Asian women after, just such a legacy of colonization and war and violence from the United States perpetuated on Asian countries, and how that's led to an entitlement and ownership over Asian women, especially, but just Asian bodies here in the States, and how that leads to things like, for me, if I'm, and I've, both laughed and, felt moments of real sadness with my friends flipping through Facebook pictures of potential partners and seeing if they've dated other Asian women, right? And how just like heartbreaking that you even have to ask the question that is, and how that's tied directly from that history of colonization and warring. But I really agree with you, Vu. So I think, first point is that within Asian communities, I think we have to be disaggregated. I think we have to be comprehensive and really rigorous about how we're talking about anti-Asian violence. And then to your question about how that's similar or different from other racial groups, I think, Vu, I appreciated your point, because I think you're bringing up that slow violence, like the slow violence of poverty, like the slow violence of income disparities, which I think is really, really important and isn't always talked about. And then two, the acute violence of like police violence against our Black and Latinx brothers and sisters. And I think, one response we should have in noticing the difference in increased police violence against Black and Latinx people is making sure that in this moment of anti-Asian hate, that we're not perpetuating more punitive measures, more policing in our communities, because that doesn't help our communities, that doesn't help our elders, that doesn't help the people that we love. And also it can perpetuate increased violence against Black and Latinx people who are disproportionately affected by the police. And that feels incredibly critical. And something that we can't forget is something that's an outcome of noticing the differences between the violence in different racial groups.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much for that. I mean, that is, I mean, I appreciate your, adding to this discussion, really a level of social justice discourse around class, right? And sort of the conflicts that arise, the slow conflicts or slow forms of violence that are less discussed, between ethnic communities, within the community, but also just in society generally, right? Particularly a community that is invisible in so many ways politically, in terms of who can vote and who can't vote, who's a legitimate subject of rights and who's not, right? How do we think about violence when some subjects aren't even considered people, really? I mean, in the scope of things, and historically maybe never have, right? So going back to part of this conversation that that Carolyn brought up about colonization. How do we begin even to start teasing apart, the ideologies of anti-Blackness, the ideologies about what it means to be Asian, that are really like, forms of subjectivity that were constructed hundreds of years ago, prior to us even being born, right? Our parents being born, our parents' parents being born. And how do we start chipping away or really producing counter discourses that can be effective, right? How do we do that? How do we begin to do that? And in a community that is so creative, how do we start that agenda?
Mm-hmm. I love that we're talking about class and ideology today, and Caroline, I completely agree that the Asian American community, that class issues are probably one of the biggest driving issues, and the income disparity, and I think that plays into why positive stereotyping, that some people like to call it, becomes such a huge issue, because Asians are all expected to be smart and affluent and be able to do this, and that, and it creates pressure, and it creates depression and mental health issues when you can't live up to those standards. As far as the ideology, I appreciated what Caroline said about the Asian dating scene, on that perspective as being an Asian woman. I would say that being an Asian gay male, I feel like that colonialism, I guess, fetishization of Asian people and Asian bodies also exists in our community. I am a 6'3", broadly built Asian man, which is not something that you normally see every day on a regular basis. But then when you also combine that with idealized images and bodies in the gay community, that adds on a whole nother layer to things. And so I think it starts with looking at the paradigms we see things with, looking at what is being portrayed as normal, or what's being portrayed, period. And are we presenting diverse images, diverse bodies, diverse people in our conversations? Are we including folks? And sometimes you have to go out there and grab them and bring them in, because I know the Asian American community is normally one of the more hesitant ones to join the conversation. And as awful as the Atlanta shootings and as the rise in hate crimes with it, really has created a surgence in the Asian American community to talk about these issues. And I think there's been a reluctance there in the past and a little bit of a complacency in that if we, keep on doing what you're doing, keep your head down. Like they won't like mess with you if you just fall into these two lanes and fit what they think an Asian should be. So I think we're beginning to break out of that, and I think representation like Margaret Cho and as you said, Minnie, getting people in office and making sure that our voices, our community is heard. In my local town in Connecticut, we have a very large influx of Indian Americans, and the population has been growing, and we recently elected our state senator as someone from their community, and the way that it's changed the feel and the vibe and just the feeling of acceptance, and that there's someone out there that's looking out for our behalf, it makes a difference. So even doing those small things like casting a vote or writing a letter or joining a commission or seeing what's out there, I think those are the starting points to this very big problem. And I think we have to look to see what those starting points can be, because I feel like people try to say we're going to end racism in a day, but that unfortunately can't happen. But there's a lot of things we can be doing to help start that process.
Thanks so much for that, Vu, and thanks for the question, Minnie. Yeah, I think what first comes to mind is just aligning with whiteness does not free us. It doesn't free us, and it never has, and it never will. It makes me think about Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings. That's just really, really tremendous book, and I think one of her many points is about how Asians have been kind of like recruited as junior partners in white America and white supremacy. And the cycle is really vicious of, colonization, again, warring and violence in Asian countries, as sort of the myth around sort of American optimism, sort of bringing in immigrant communities to say you can be successful here. And then Asian families and immigrant families feeling indebted to white America. And exactly what you're talking about, Vu, an outcome of that indebtedness is a sort of docileness, or can be a kind of docileness, or docility, and sort of keeping your head down, working for survival, and also anti-Blackness is another thing, is another tool that's wielded by white supremacy to keep us apart from each other. And I think there's a lot of work to do, but one thing that I've been really thinking about is, and a lot of people have been leading on this, is just remembering our history. I think I've been doing some, reading on just how much Black people have been so supportive of Asian lives, and have pushed to make sure that Asians are more safe and more held. Like I think about Muhammad Ali, who risked his career to be against the Vietnam War, and just some of his quotes and just some of his just absolute brashness and openness about supporting Asian people. I think about like Frederick Douglass denounced the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Like we just have a long history, and there's a long history of Black people, among others, just supporting Asian lives. And I think remembering that history, remembering those moments of solidarity that we aren't taught in schools, that young people aren't taught in schools, is so important. We have models of this. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have models of this. And I think, Minnie, you have a question about this later on, that we can turn to for inspiration, which feels really important, and I think has been really inspiring and invigorating for me. And then the last point I'll make is about, I think it's about like queer spaces specifically. I remember growing up, growing up in Lexington, Kentucky, I think it's one of the states with the fewest Asians. Growing up, so I'm 28 now. I wasn't out in high school, though I had fallen in love with, a woman, my best friend, and we weren't out. And I remember when I first came to school at Yale for undergrad, it was the most Asians I'd ever seen. It was the most queer people I'd ever seen, but I didn't feel comfortable in queer spaces. And I think it wasn't until later on when I really realized why. I think queerness for me was really associated, outside of my personal experience of just love, was associated with whiteness. When I thought about the GSAs in the GSA in my high school, or when I thought about the queer spaces at Yale, it was mostly white people. And I think it's really important for queer spaces to be a part of the broader movement for justice. And that means queer issues are, yes, about marriage equality, but are also about anti-poverty, are also about anti-policing, are also about supporting a broader coalition of individuals for health and safety. It's about housing, it's about so much more, healthcare. And I think if those spaces were more aligned with a broader movement for justice, I think I would have felt a broader sense, or a more intimate sense of friendship and community. And I am excited. And that's why, maybe the last thing I'll say is that's why I think I'm so appreciative of the Pride Center and the work that the Pride Center is doing in New Haven.
Then not a lot has changed, or at least I'm not sure much has changed in Lexington, Kentucky. I do not see very many Asian folk here on the streets. And it's interesting because there is great queer spaces, and I'm having a great time in queer spaces. So that's kind of like an interesting thing to enter into, that a space that is LGBTQ friendly, that's meant to be open and a silo to so many of us. And for part of my identity, 100%, I feel at home there and it's great there. But there's also that other part where it's like, there's no one in this room that looks like me, and like just subliminally that does something to your brain. Like, I can't even pinpoint what it is, but it's like you aren't fully 100% comfortable because you feel like you're an odd duckling out there. So yeah, I definitely feel you on that.
I think that's these are fascinating things to be thinking about. I think, Carolyn, I'm a little bit older than you. So I actually remember the time prior to marriage equality. There were always people who talked about marriage equality, right? But that was not the agenda of the gay community in the 90s. It became the agenda. And then, of course, when the radical right jumped on the anti marriage equality thing, then it sort of became something that gay people have to fight for because of this opposition, right? But for me, for example, I remember going to a pretty white pride party thing, which I was not used to doing. And at the time, my partner was Mexican, so the two of us went. And one of the women, was largely a white gathering, and the woman was going on about marriage equality and all the reasons why we should do it. And all the reasons she cited were reasons like that. Of course, there was the hospital issue, but basic economic issues like, insurance, health insurance, like, should that be tied to, a corporation or to work, right? Or should it just be a universal health right? And so when we left the party, the two of us were looking at each other and we were like, she's crazy, right? And that was prior to the time when it really launched itself as sort of like marriage equality as the gay agenda, because it really wasn't. There was this time when gays were really about challenging the norms of society. And that was really who we were and what we meant, right? And maybe part of what we can think about is, how do we move back there? How do we go back to that? I'm fine with people getting married, not getting married, whatever. But there was a time when feminists said, marriage was the problem, right? And we need to be critical. I have nothing against people who want to get married, but we need to really think critically about the limits of these institutions and what our agenda really needs to focus on, right?
Yeah.
Right? So how do we do that? Right?
I think marriage equality was a great thing that happened, and it was a great start for our movement. But I feel I remember when marriage equality passed, when I was in college. I graduated in 2010, so it was right in the middle of my formative years as a coming out individual and learning my activism strengths, that we were doing this huge marriage equality push. And as soon as it passed, I felt like there was like a deflation in the entire activism movement in the queer community. And it was like, there's still things going on. Like, it doesn't stop with marriage equality. I think what marriage equality did for us, it's very necessarily, and I'm 100% glad that it was passed. And I think the biggest tool that it was is, I feel like when people look at activist movements, they try to get the low-hanging fruit or the bright shiny object. And for sexual orientation, the easiest thing for people to identify that to is our relationships, our partners, our romantics. So making the driver of the movement marriage makes it very easy for people to comprehend. And I remember when I came out to my mother, it was an entire disaster, because there's also the limitations in understanding for Asians of a certain background. I mean, my parents came over during the Vietnam War as refugees, and where they came from, like, being LGBT wasn't a thing at all. It wasn't that they disliked it or they had something against it. Like, there was no language or comprehension or concepts that they could build off of. And so when I came out to my mother, she had like no idea what I was talking about, whether I was like trying to like make more friends or like what we were trying to get at. And I remember like 5 years later, we had a conversation about gay marriage. And she's like, of course there has to be gay marriage. How else are they going to pay their taxes? So it like puts those things in like that very literal framework that people can understand. And so I think it was a great starting point, but I think we now need to take a step back and see that there's all of these more hidden underlying things that we have to dig other things up to get to, like income inequality, like poverty, that is not going to be something that you necessarily can see like 100% clearly. I mean, if you look around, you'll definitely notice it. But like a marriage certificate, a wedding, those are things that people can get instant gratification on. And these things that are kind of more of a slow struggle that has had decades and centuries of systemic racism and colonization and all these other things that they have to dig through. That's where the next step is, and that's where we need to be forging into.
So when you're talking about marriage, it brings up another point, right? And that is, and it goes back to something Carolyn was saying earlier. This emphasis on marriage and marriage as a legal right, right? And this emphasis on the law, perhaps that strengthens the gay community's agenda about marriage, but it also strengthens it gives a legitimacy to certain kinds of law, right, and the state in sanctioning certain rights to certain individuals. The same law which really takes away or doesn't give rights to many other individuals, legal rights to other individuals. And we've seen over the last 5 years a deflation in the rights of migrants and immigrant communities, right, and immigrants generally. How do we also create visibility for communities within our community that are simply invisible politically, and in many other ways we don't even have to think about them? They're little, they're sort of metaphorically or symbolically the homeless in our community, right? Like they literally have no legal home here, which is ridiculous if we think about human rights, right? So how do we think about that also in this discussion about violence, right? I don't know if you, Vu or Carolyn, if you want to think about that.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with this one. Yeah, I think So this is going to be a weird tangent on this question, and you asked a really thought-provoking one. Like me and Carolyn's faces are in the same like brain cycle right now that we're processing how to approach this. But I think like the way that our politics are set up, and the two-party system that we have, I think Asian Americans and Asian voices are oftentimes taken for granted and expected to vote a certain way or do a certain thing. So I feel like Asian American issues have been left on the back burner for so long because there's this assumption that would say, well, why are you going to go out and speak to them? They're already going to do what you expect them to do. And I think that contributes to the loss of Asian voices in our communities and in our activism, because they don't see an incentive to make us part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for that, Boo. And thanks for the question, Minnie. A few thoughts. I think it reminds me of sort of the top of the conversation we talked about how the Asian experience is so broad. And it's just important to be really nuanced. And that's what your question is bringing up. We have to be really nuanced. And I think as it relates to the immigrant community in America, I think about the role of mutual aid, the role of direct supports when the government isn't supporting. Like I think about in New Haven, one of the most inspiring groups for me is the Samia Collective, which started sort of in response to COVID-19, creating food packages and support and like a food garage for immigrants, undocumented folks who weren't able to have access to the resources the government was providing. And since then, they're continuing to provide that support, but also organize. And I think that's the second piece is organizing our communities. And I think it reminds me, we've brought up the model minority myth. It reminds me of that because I think one of many dangerous pieces of the model minority myth is its ability to take away our political agency, to depoliticize our elders, undocumented Asians who are here. And I think that's really sinister of white supremacy. And because look, Asian Americans help support in Georgia for Ossoff and Warnock to be elected. They're aware of the political power of Asians. They know it. White America knows it. And so the model minority myth is so sinister to say and to sort of accuse Asians of what you're saying, Boo, either all voting in some kind of way, not engaging them, not reaching out to them, not seeing them as political agents in our communities. And I think that is such a missed opportunity and so critical. And so I think it's so to summarize, I think seeing all individuals as fundamentally able to be have ownership and be political agents is really, really critical and feels so important to the organizing work that we have to do moving forward. Minnie, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. So I'm going to tangent a little bit over just because we're past the halfway mark. So I want to talk more about actual strategies. And I also want to sort of move towards the relationship that I think we need to talk about. On one hand, the sort of internal discussion we need to have about how to create coalition within the community of Asian Americans, right? Around a queer agenda, a queer Asian agenda, but also how do we create that coalition with other communities of color, and specifically working with Black Lives Matters and communities that are differently targeted in our society, and really need us to wake up and work together with them. How do we do that? How do we begin doing that?
This is one of the other reasons I'm really appreciative for this conversation today. because I didn't know Caroline before, and I didn't know Minnie before. And I was like, why did I not know about these two amazing queer Asian resources? Because oftentimes, like at least I do, I feel like there are not enough resources or like not enough colleagues like in this movement in order to progress things forward. So when we talk about like how do we come together as a queer Asian community and make change and have these conversations, like one of the starting points is actually creating space for that and finding others that are likelihood. So I love what you mentioned earlier, Caroline, about the group that started New Haven around AAPI and that it's affirming and a group that I have been involved with recently in Hartford is Kamora's Cultural Corner. Has community conversations over Zoom on Wednesdays, and I started joining those, and they span a whole variety of topics, but Black Lives Matter, white supremacy, they definitely come in there, and that really has helped in my education and putting ourselves into those conversations and learning and educating ourselves, I think is a very needed point, because I will be honest, I entered into that realm and that world thinking, oh, I do LGBTQ nonprofit work all the time. Like I have awareness of Asian American issues, but humbling yourself and putting yourself in another community space and having the willingness to listen and not necessarily contribute at the first time out or need to say something. And I think that's hard for also people involved in nonprofit activists is just like giving an opinion right away, but allowing yourself to be receptive of other experiences, their stories, their identities, and really taking the time to digest that. I think you have to do that before you create that intersection, because if you don't understand people and where they're coming from and their stories, there's no way to work with them.
Thanks for that, Vu. Yeah, I agree. I'm so glad that we know each other now, and excited to get like boba tea together this summer. As it relates to sort of within the Asian community, things that come to mind very similar, I think, are like healing, friendship, joy. Also representation. Vu, you brought up a really good point about representation, and I think representation isn't everything. It isn't a place to stop, but it's so strengthening. Like I think more, for me, visibility of queer Asian couples who are older is so valuable for me to be able to imagine my own future. I've never met. Well, maybe actually, Minnie, you actually might be one of the first. Almost makes me emotional to think about like queer sort of older women that I've met who are who have sustained relationships, and that's really, really meaningful for me. And so that representation, I think, is again not everything, but it is powerful for imagination. It's powerful for healing. I think the other thing I'd say is about mental health. And Vu, I think you brought this up. Mental health. Lack of access to mental health resources, stigma around mental health is just such a prevalent and big part of the Asian community, as we all know. I know that's true for me. None of my family members have ever accessed mental health resources in sort of a structured or professional way. And so I think for me, I see it in myself, a barrier to even know where to start. And I lean on my sort of chosen family for that kind of support. And then as it relates to the last part of your question, Minnie, about solidarity with other people of color. Vu, I think you said it really well. I love the use of the word humility. I think that feels really true. I know this is very concrete and very specific, but for the AAPI group, New Haven group, one thing that we are doing is inviting other organizing groups to come speak to AAPI New Haven, specifically the organizing group, to learn from them, sort of twofold. One, learn from different groups that have been doing this work for a long time, to think about our own models for decision-making, collective decision-making, and how we think about the work that we want to do. And then two, to see if there's the inevitable overlap in the work that we're doing and how we can support each other. And so I think fundamentally building those relationships, building those friendships, being able to laugh together, cry together, do work together, feels really foundational to that kind of movement building.
Mm-hmm. On the point of representation, we are in Pride Month officially right now, and I recently attended the flag raising in West Hartford of the gay pride flag, and that was a really emotional experience for me because you're like in the middle of one of the most, like, I guess, social places in the state, and seeing a gay pride flag raised over that, and it just kind of makes me think of other aspirations to see. And I, like, if I ever got to the day where I was at like a Lunar New Year festival and there was like a pride booth at it, like that would be like shaking to me. And I think like that is like where representation could have a huge impact. I would probably like enter in there with my boba tea and like drop it on the floor, and I would never do that unless something monumental occurred. And I think that would be it. And so just like little pieces of that, or like, you know, I've been to a lunar festival and someone's wearing a rainbow pride pin, and I was like, oh my God, that's so great that they are here in all of their Asian American greatness, but also still celebrating this part of their identity. So I think that representation can be very key in those ways.
You know, I want to add to what you're both saying. I mean, I think this discussion about representation is really important. Going back to what Carolyn was saying earlier about role models, right? Like, you know, there was Muhammad Ali. I mean, what he did was, undone at that time. No one did that. His career as a boxer really rested on his representation, and the fact that he was took a position on Vietnam, and so did Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and all the Black leaders took a position on Vietnam, which was phenomenal for that time, right? That really said a lot, right? And then we know so little about our own history, and I'm going to put into the chat a couple names, and that I think you know, but maybe others don't. But there's Grace Lee Boggs, and there's also Yuri Kochiyama. And I'm putting their names in there because there are actually documentaries now made on both these women, several, I think, and they're very good documentaries that I would encourage everyone to watch. These are Asian Americans. There was also Patsy Mink, who was very much involved in putting together and being one of the key writers of Title IX, I think it was, right? And much of her experience around women's issues was also influenced by her work and her experience as an Asian woman working with other communities of color, actually, through college and afterwards, right? So a lot of this work is all so connected, right? But one of my happiest moments, honestly, every year is Gay Pride. And, you know, I mentioned to both you, Carolyn and Vu, that, you know, I became an instant art activist, you know, 5 years ago after the election, just as a way to stay alive, quite frankly, because I was so depressed. And it was a way to sort of do something productive instead of just being depressed. And so I had like all these social justice messages and whatnot. And it was thanks to my partner that I actually put them on t-shirts so that people could actually wear them around like human billboards. That was the way she described it. And I would go to Pride since then, every year, except for COVID. And this year I'm skipping, sadly, again, because of COVID. But I would have a little booth. And I would have my little social justice t-shirts out, and it was a way for me to like tell the world that like we're here doing social justice work too. We might be Asian Americans, but like we speak, we have voices, we are creative. I mean, you know, my art is not so great, to tell you the truth. I'm still learning, but you know, we do all we can to be part of this movement, and that's in the sort of steps of those who came before us, right? Like Yuri Kochiyama, who worked very closely with Malcolm X, with Gracely Boggs, who did so much work in Detroit, right? When Detroit was really struggling, and it still is struggling, right? And so, you know, where are we in this line of succession? Mm-hmm. And what bigger steps do we take so that those after us have more room to work, more room to move the movement in different directions, right? Mm-hmm. Perhaps beyond what we can conceive of or think about creatively, right?
Oh, I love you, Minnie. I mean, we are here and we talk. If there are no truer words that you take out of this presentation, we are here and we talk. Because I think that's something that leads to so much anti-Asian violence, is the assumption that we don't talk and that we don't speak and that we don't fight back and that we don't have creative ideas or voices are going to do anything about it. And we've been able to show now the power of the Asian American Bloc and what we can do and the amazing minds and voices and creativity that's out there. So I just love you bringing that up. And on the point of history, 100%. And I know Carolyn talked to this earlier, but I can't remember a time in my education years, either through primary, secondary, collegiate, that I can really remember like a strong like Asian American part of the course content. And now I view documentaries and things later on, things from like the Japanese internment camps, and how epically horrifying they were. And I don't think people realize like that there are those pieces of our history, because we call them internment camps as if they were anything less than prison / glorified slavery / whatever you want to call it. And the Chinese railroad and the Chinese folks that were used to build our railroad system across the country, and all of the abuse with that, child labor in California and the history around that. These are the things that we are not teaching, and these are the lessons that we are not learning, because I feel like the greatest tool that we have is history, to learn what we shouldn't do anymore. And I feel like those are the messages that we are not hearing.
Thank you both so much. I totally agree. It actually reminds me of a kind of the conversation we've been having about representation, and a kind of maybe a nuance in the conversation about representation. Because yes, okay, do I love Feifel Stewart in the show Atypical because she's queer and Japanese and Korean and Chinese of Chinese descent? Absolutely, I want that. But I also think I want representation of queer Asians in media and in movies who are not just queer, but use queer ideology, principles, practices in the work that they do, that are politically active, that are engaged. I hunger for that kind of media representation of Asians, as well as I still can count on one hand like how many queer Asians I've actually seen just being queer and being happy and being alive on TV. So I want both, but that kind of queer representation feels really important in the way we tell stories, even if they're fiction. And the last piece I'll say, and this is what inspires me about both of you two. I think a lot about our Asian young people, our Asian young queers, and Minnie, I think it's so powerful that we're behind the table at Pride, and Vu, that you wear a crown. I think that's so important for young people. I know whenever I, talk in front of young people, especially if I always do, but especially if there are, Asians in the audience, Asian students or Asian young people, I always out myself. Because I think even if there's just one person, if they are able to look up there and see someone like, wow, someone is partnered, is out, is happy, is queer and visible, and is civically engaged, like that feels so meaningful. And so I'm just so grateful for both of you for the audacity of that and the courage of that, because it feels so important, especially for this next generation of folks right below us.
Well, adding to that, Caroline, what can we do literally for the generation below us? What specific things can you think of right now that people could do, they could go out and do for those young people who are looking for answers, for role models, looking for ways to survive in the world, whether they're queer or queer allies or whatnot. What can we give them as in advice or otherwise?
Yeah, a lot of thoughts, but just for queer young people who are in New Haven, two groups. Obviously, the Pride Center, which you must be familiar with if you're watching this. New Haven Pride is the first Pride I ever went to, and I think that's for a reason. It's because of the Pride Center's leadership, because of the safe spaces they build. It's really hard to build a safe public space where hundreds of people are at, and I think New Haven Pride does a tremendous job of that, and the Pride Center does a tremendous job. So thank you, Allah, Patrick, and all the folks. So the Pride Center's resources are huge. And I think they have youth organizing that they do. Two is AAPI New Haven. I would encourage young people to be a part of this group. And hopefully I can put my email in the chat or whatever, so you can be a part of it. But I think that's special because it's new. I think that it would be really important, and I think that the AAPI New Haven will be a stronger space if young people are leading it. And so for young people who are listening to this, come be a part of the leadership and leading and informing and actually shaping this group from the very beginning and from the outset. Your leadership, your voice will be critical to making sure that it is impactful work. So that's a couple things that come to mind, Minnie.
Oh, Vu, would you like to
add? Sure thing. Yeah, I think as Whitney Houston would say, the children are our future. 100% true. And I think most recently, there was a gap created in the services for LGBTQ youth, and I think we are all a part of filling that gap. There's a great organization in Hartford area, but they do things around Connecticut called Q+, and they're doing amazing work to support LGBTQ youth. And I think folks like us have to remember the importance of mentorship and finding those youth where they're at and embracing them and developing them, and remembering that mentorship is a two-way street, that the youth nowadays have innovative ideas that we can't even imagine, and not to suppress it, but to harness it and to figure out how it can push us forward, and making sure that we learn as much from them as they learn from us. Because that's the best way to get there.
Excellent. One of the things I would like to share is and I share this with my students, who are many are students of color, is how much I love them. I think we're trapped in a world where we're so, brainwashed by the idea that that love is something that is either legal or only biological. That somehow biology is everything. And the one thing that as queers we can bring to this discussion is that biology is not everything. That love actually exists outside of the law and outside of biology. And after today, Carolyn and Vu, I see you as part of my family. And the way I explain it to my students is that it's like a web, a giant web, a feminist web that we're all creating together. And we're all each one of us is the intersection of part of that web. And the greater that web is, the more of us on this web, the greater the network is, and the stronger we are together, right? And we don't have to be married. We don't have to be biologically related. In fact, biology sometimes is not a good, sort of predictor of protection or safety for many people. So how do we, we can first express that love for one another, which sounds so Pollyannish, but it's true. I mean, I can't tell you how much I love my students, and I hope they know how much I love them. And I feel like I know the two of you in a way that that I couldn't possibly know other people, and I will always be here for you, Caroline, for you, Vu, for all of those who are listening here, know that there are people here who love you and who will be there for you, right? That we believe in you, and we believe in your future and what you will do to advance social justice for everybody. I want to thank you personally, both of you and everybody else. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, the work that you will do, for being here today, for being here tomorrow. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing.
It's been an absolute pleasure getting to meet both of you and having this conversation.
Totally agree.
Thank you, Ala, for doing this, for bringing us all together here. This has been so amazing. And from what I hear about the day is that it's going to be a whole day of activities. And I'm centered in New York, but to know that this is happening right in New Haven, which is just a short little train ride away, is fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. You want to add anything, the two of you, just in last statements?
You did great. That was amazing.
You all are unbelievable. Thank you. I've been sitting here just like screaming in my apartment, full of love and admiration for you all and for all of the work that's happening, that you're each doing individually, and that's happening at the New Haven Pride Center. What a gift. So thank you, each of you. Thank you, Minnie, Caroline, and Vu, for all that you have brought for this day. Thank you to everybody watching. Keep with us. There's lots more coming. Our next program is The Complexity of Black Sexuality, and that starts at noon. Remember, the center is here for you year-round with programming, support services, case management, and more. You can find out about all of our upcoming programming at the newhavenpridecenter.org. And don't forget to explore the rest of the International Festival of Arts and Ideas programming this month at artidea.org, including a drag show on the New Haven Green as the grand finale. So many, many thanks, Minnie, Caroline, and Vu. We hope to see you at the next program in 23 minutes.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth.